Good morning. Welcome to our panel. When we discussed this last year, we, as you know and you've done yourself, we talked about a lot of things. And one of the things we talked about in this theme of this conference was the actual experiences that people have in either teaching or learning as a second language. And we talked about the various obstacles, and my own personal interest was in the emotional resistance that we face. And, you know, I faced it myself, and I still face it in speaking with very fluent elders, and you just feel a little bit intimidated, and that happens in a lot of things where you kind of approach the edge and then finally you have to jump off and trust the parachute. And a lot of times we hear of people in our communities that are raised in the language and capable of understanding what's going on, but they don't participate in speaking. And I've seen that phenomenon often, and I think that people are always wanting to encourage them to come in and share what they know, because they have the gift of comprehension, which is part of the sequence of becoming fluent. And I think some of the experiences that the panelists will share are with their experience in second language learning, either personally or as teachers. And before we get started, I just wanted to share an article that I found in the New Yorker magazine. It's called Maltese for Beginners, and it's about language and the ideas of language and how we communicate, not specific to native language, but in general, that's a trait of human beings, that you have things that you think about and you want to communicate them. And in this sense, and in this series of immersion practices, we're talking about things that work and things that don't work, and phenomena that we're trying to understand, and things of that nature. So please accept this panel, and they will speak for themselves, and I will let them introduce themselves. And I've known these people for a long time, except her, and she's a very charming lady, so I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say. So with that, I will pass this to Richard, and he'll start us.
My name is Richard Littlebear. That's my English name. My Cheyenne name is Vikis Nisto. Pupo metanen naista. Not so what's done. I get this a nice tissiness. No a word tissiness. Na nishnamonias. Nasaan no pervat start. Het is tissinsto. Somehow wish namone miss it. Namone as henne. Tidis tat. My English name is Richard Littlebear, and my Cheyenne name, and the one I grew up with, is Vikis Nisto, which means howling bird. And I can remember whenever I got into trouble, whenever my grandmother called me, Vikis Nisto, I knew I was in trouble, because that was a very formal way of disciplining us, using my Cheyenne name. And sometimes she would say, she would say, she didn't speak she didn't speak English. And when she would say my name, which is Richard, it would always come out wretched. And I did feel wretched whenever she said that. So that was a slight difference in there. And I knew I was in trouble when she said either used one or the other. So anyhow, I was raised by my grandmother and spoke Cheyenne first. Then I left the reservation when I was about 14 years old and came back off and on to the reservation. And the first year that I was gone to school, I came back and I found out that the mechanism that makes you speak Cheyenne and the actual mechanism that works, the sounds and all that, sometimes they didn't quite match. And when I would make a mistake among my own people, I got a lot of condemnation. And one of the more stinging remarks that I got was, boy, when I made a mistake, one of the elders said, "It sure didn't take you long to become a little white boy, did it?" And that was really a stinging remark, especially among the Cheyenne people. And I almost quit talking Cheyenne after that because I was very fluent in English. And I figured, wow, that's going to do me well. But after 2 weeks, I decided that my language is my language, and I'm going to speak it. So, and that was a good decision, and I was about 14 years old at that time. So that's kind of the introduction to why I'm sitting up here. The other reason why I'm sitting up here is I was walking by the cafeteria and I saw these people, and "You're recruited," they said, to come and sit on the panel. So that's my big qualification for being here. I'll pass it on to Sheilah.
Richard, would you talk a little bit about your experience with your language camps that you were leading and the learners, whatever you observed from that?
Okay. When I first came back to the reservation, let me step back a little bit. When I first came back to the reservation, I had worked for about 9 years up in Alaska, going out to the villages and helping with technical assistance with K-12 schools, and sometimes with the colleges that were out there. And I was pretty much the only Cheyenne speaker probably within a radius of 2,000 to 3,000 miles. And I kept thinking, well, this must be how it feels to be the only speaker left on the planet, because I did not have anybody to speak to. And one of the ways I kept in touch with my own language was to speak to myself, speak Cheyenne to myself when there wasn't anybody around. And I would have conversations with myself. And I always tell people those were some of the most intelligent conversations I ever engaged in. Well, because there was nobody else around to dispute me. But I later found out that was called self-immersion. That was a technique that a lot of people used. And I just happened on it because we spend a lot of time in charter airplanes where you're sitting this close to the pilot and feeling kind of a lot of trepidation about being up in the air and what if we have a wreck and all that. And so I would sit there and I would describe what I was seeing, and that kept it alive for me. So when I came back to the reservation and I was selected as the Director of Cultural Affairs, one of the things that happened was the elders at the Senior Citizens Complex asked me to come and speak. And they said, but you won't be able to come over until 2 months from now because we already have other people scheduled. And I fretted about this, I stewed about this, and I thought, well, I'm going to have a hard time. And I kept that frame of mind going. And I finally I decided, all of this stewing about what I'm going to say or whatever they're going to ask is being counterproductive, because I was just working myself into a situation where I knew I would make mistakes. And so I just forgot about it. Every time the thought came in, I would chase it away from my brain. And I went there at the scheduled time, and I spoke I was there for almost 2 hours, but most of the time I spoke nothing but Cheyenne. And I did I did about between 45 and an hour of speaking nothing but Cheyenne. And I was really thankful that I had a good vocabulary in Cheyenne, because if I didn't have a word for a specific thing that I was talking about, I could describe it. I could say this is what it is, because we have those words that really directly say something about what you're talking about, or you can describe it because the word itself is descriptive. So, and that's what got me through. At the end of the session, we had eaten and done all this, and I had pretty well kept the attention of all the elders, and all the elders that were there are now gone. We use them as a resource, and every time something would come up, how do you say this, or what does this mean? We'd say, well, let's go ask Daniel or Harriet. We knew who they were, and we'd go ask them. Now we don't have that luxury anymore. We are now the elders, and me as an elder speaking the Cheyenne language, I feel very inadequate because I don't have the same background that they did. But after speaking for almost an hour in Cheyenne, and I was beginning to feel really comfortable with that, because I was telling jokes in Cheyenne and making it kind of taking hold of it myself. The elders stood up, and they all got in a line, and they all came up to me, and they shook my hand. And many of them commented saying, it's good to see that somebody who has been off the reservation so long, and somebody who is so well educated as you are, can still speak our language as well as you do. And that really made me feel good. I felt more accepted at that time. I felt that I had passed some sort of informal test. And from there on, they were always very welcoming whenever we went over to ask them for, use them as human dictionaries, for instance. And they were always really welcoming. And for me, it was particularly good, because at that time, I was really uncertain about my role. I had been off the reservation for quite a while, being in the Army, going to the military, and going to school off the reservation for so many years, and working off the reservation. But I kept my language up. And before that, I had come from a background where I saw English as the only way to make ourselves in this world. I'm on my undergraduate. That idea that the Cheyenne, the English language was the only way to make it in the world was so strong that in my undergraduate years, I was an English major. I took all the English. I can tell you about the Plantagenets and all about the Tudors and all about the royalty and their little problems and all that kind of stuff. But I could not have told you about what was going on my own reservation, how the government worked and all that. So I was really way out there. And when I brought that same sort of mentality back to the reservation when I came back to work there. And there I was a federal programs officer. And one of the grants that they had gotten was a bilingual education grant, and that was right around the middle 1970s when we were included in the legislation at that time in the Bilingual Education Act, and so there was this money available, and the principal would come out and ask me and say, we want you to take over this project. And I would say, you know, I'm against teaching Native American languages. And they came out about 4 times. About the 5th time they came out, he had the superintendent with him, and I thought, boy, this is big. And they said, we would like for you to take over this project. And I said, you know, we've had this discussion I don't know how many times. And the superintendent spoke up and said, well, tonight at the board meeting, we're going to abolish the office of the federal programs officer. I became an instant bilingual education advocate then because they were taking my job away from me. Anyhow, at that time, I started thinking about what was happening, and because the older people would come in and say, "How come you're going to be teaching a language that was denied us?" Because many of the elders were boarding school products, and I was teaching it. I was working at a boarding school, and I went to that same boarding school myself. So after doing all that, I became a bilingual and bilingual education and polylingual advocate, and that sort of has taken me all over the United States and Canada and all over the world, in fact, because of my interest in the indigenous languages. And I read articles, and some people have come up and talked to me about those articles, and they said, those articles are old. I wrote them, and I'm still writing, but I just haven't published anything. But I was writing about 2002 because I had all these ideas about doing research and doing all that kind of stuff. Because when I first started out with Native America, with our own language, there was no research on second language acquisition as it pertained to Native American languages. So my education was from the boat people who came across shortly after the Vietnam War, and then the other piece of that education came from reading about the Spanish language, the acquisition, and just whenever it said Spanish, just substituting Cheyenne for it. And I became a full-blown indigenous language advocate ever since. I still am. I think there's always when we go to get an get a job application and all that, and we get interviewed. It's all in English, and we have to know that. And they said, yeah, it's good. Because one of the things that I have come up to in my life is that English is really good. There's no adversarial relationship between the Cheyenne language I know and the English language that I speak. There's no adversarial, there's nothing adversarial between the two. In fact, they're highly complementary because one of them satisfies it provides me a living. It provides me a background to be able to make a living, to live in this world very well. The other part, the Cheyenne part, provides me spiritual sustenance, because in our languages are the language in itself is so embedded with spiritual references that you can't separate the spirituality from the Cheyenne, from the language itself, and therefore from the culture. They're intermeshed. They're tightly wound together. And if you're a first language speaker of any native language, because I can only speak from a Cheyenne perspective, is that this intermeshing of the spiritual and the practical are so well interwoven that we hardly ever think about them. We hardly ever say, well, this is that part and this is this part. No, they're tightly wound together so that if you lose one, you're going to eventually lose the other. If you lose a language, you're losing the main conveyor of that culture. And all of you understand that. I'm sort of speaking to the choir here, but you all understand that. So if you start analyzing your language, you'll find that there's a lot of spirituality embedded into it, so that the spirituality was a daily experience, not every Sunday, not just that one day. It pervaded everything. Every ceremony is a prayer ceremony, is a prayer meeting. That's the way it's embedded in our language and in our daily lives. So, but when I came back, I started a bilingual immersion camp, and that's been going on ever since I've been there. So it's probably in its 22nd or 23rd year, and it's really well attended. We have kids. We have two of them. One is for the toddlers, and the other one is for the children slightly older. And at first it was just like a babysitting service. The people would come and drop their kids off, and we'd put up with them. Now it's much more instructive, because people now see the value of the language and the loss that's going on. On my reservation, we did an informal survey back in September 15th of 2015, and we came up with 566 first language speakers that were still alive on the reservation. And after that time, at that time, that really woke a lot of people up as to how endangered our language is. So, and we've been working at it ever since. We've been trying to get, working with the young people, working with the older people, and right now we're teaching our language. It's difficult. I mean, I speak about it as if it was smooth. It isn't. There's always detractors, and they're always saying, well, that's not the way my grandmother said it, or that's not the way Bernie said it, or that's not the way Ashland District says it. So you're always in these little things. And that takes away a lot of energy. Why don't we just speak? We don't say the same thing about the English language. Whenever we use the word ain't, nobody ever says anything about that. They just let it pass on through. I heard people say, us guys, we got to go there. You know, nobody's raised a word. Nobody raised any objection. But if I made the same mistake in Cheyenne, I'd have the whole tribe jumping on me. And most of you have probably experienced that too. But it's a lot of it's a lot of hard work, and I don't want to be monopolizing the whole time here, but I am, and he's glad for that. So I've already tried to trade it over to her.
Nè quang ta long ba nè có cháu hơn mà nè yan hopi mà chịu nè kalwang nè songopang aksino nè kyang nè Tucson, Arizona, pek University of Arizona, pek tekay na kay papek ki kyang tumalata punepahan mama chika Sheilah Nicholas yan tuat matsua. So I'm from the Hopi community. My Hopi name is Kotahon Mana, which translates into White Bear Girl, and it's reflective of my godmother's clan, the Bear Clan. My own clan is the Sun Forehead Clan. We're a matrilineal society, and I am from the village of Songopavi on Second Mesa, but I currently work and live in Tucson, Arizona, working at the University of Arizona. And I don't know, do you want me to do a little bit of monopolizing? So I was invited to be on this panel, and I'm very honored to be. It's an opportunity to reflect on how I got here. And I identify now as a second language relearner of my language, because I was born on Hopi and into the culture. So the first 6 years of my life was totally Hopi. At the time, there was no Head Start, no daycare, no kindergarten. So I didn't start school until I was 6 years old. And at that time was my first introduction to English. And by age 8, my parents moved to Winslow, Arizona, which is a border town about 60 miles from the reservation. And that's where I pretty much, I guess when I think back, was the first experience was colonization, because my English was accented, and I had a lot of reactions from my white peers, my classmates, and my teachers about that. So I remember going home and telling my mother, you know, tearfully that people were making fun of my language, my English. So my mom told me, and at the time I think back, because I did actually go through a period of being angry at her for telling me, well, maybe you should put away your Hopi and just practice English, which is what I did. So I never spoke Hopi from 8 years old until I started trying to do that again as an adult. So I think at that moment is when, you know, I reflect on that a lot and wonder why. And the fact that I just heard, I think it was Jerry or Richard say that many of us have the gift of understanding. But I would also say that I had a gift of that opportunity to struggle, because I think the advantage of having understood the language and spoken it very fluently for 6 years of my life, and then also not having the ability to think in it anymore, really gave me an opportunity to do the kind of work that I'm doing. So in many ways, I've gone back to also thinking about the teachings that says that you're born for a purpose. And I feel like my purpose has been to do this work, and in reflecting on it, I can see all the journey, the benchmarks that I actually experienced in order to get here, in order to be somewhat effective, I guess, in this life work. So from there, it wasn't, I never thought about language, and I was dismembered essentially from my community, meaning I wasn't out there practicing in the culture. I spent a lot of summers with my grandmother. My grandmother was really an important person in my life, and spent a lot of time doing things like going to the cornfield. So all of those things were there, but there's a lot missing. And so I did a lot of traveling and through school, high school, the Peace Corps even, but I think it was in the Peace Corps that I found out that I never thought about being a Hopi and what that meant. So I think that was really pivotal in making me think about returning back to my roots. So my graduate work is where I picked that all up and met my clan uncle in 1991 at the American Indian Language Development Institute. So that's been a really important part of my life as well. I think that was the first time I had an instructor who encouraged us to use our language, and that's when I found out that I couldn't think in it anymore. I had never even really thought about language until that time. So recognizing that, you know, it was scary. I started to think like, wow, I can't even think in my language anymore, but I could always understand it. So, you know, in between, there's about 8 years where I went back into graduate work, the doctoral program, and still in Aldi, but becoming more involved in delivering or being a part of that program. And I met Christine Sims in a workshop, and she was talking about oral immersion. And that was the only workshop I ever took, but there's something about how I just grasped onto that particular approach and thought, this is what I can do. And so I started working at those kind of practices and strategies through the American Indian Language Development Institute, but also working with my clan uncle, Emery Sikiakwaptiwa, who helped develop and publish the first Hopi language dictionary, and then meeting some of the Hopi people who came down to Aldi in the summertime, and taking language courses with all of them. But the interesting thing was that those courses were about reading and writing Hopi, not speaking. So it's just amazing to see a language you had never seen written before written. I think that was the first eye-opening thing for me. But it was really hard because it was different sounds for the English alphabet. It was trying to read the language when you didn't know where the syllables were, those kinds of things. But I think more importantly, I couldn't write what I was thinking because I wasn't thinking in Hopi. So I started practicing it, and about that time, my mom was had come back into my life in many ways. So, and she's a fluent speaker, so I started to try to talk with her about it. And that's when she went into the Hopi language and said to me, and the literal interpretation of that is, wow, when you were a child, you were fully Hopi. Of course, when the way I interpret it, I understood that I wasn't Hopi anymore because I couldn't speak the language. And that's been something very scary to me, and I thought, wow, I never thought about it that way. So I think all of those things kind of built up and motivated me to really say, what happened? What happened to our language? And in the meantime, I had children. I wasn't bringing them up in the language. I had been going to Hopi, taking my children out there, and hearing lots of comments about people saying in our community that our young people are no longer behaving in a Hopi way. They're disrespectful. They're not speaking the language, so they're not Hopi anymore. All these things were just all of a sudden in my face, you know, all of these things that I had never even thought about. So it became really important for me to think about this whole idea of like, wow, I have to take a really good look at myself and say, what is my role here? So I got involved even more, but in that time, I started working and meeting some of these individuals from Hopi who were involved in language teaching in the schools and some of the struggles they were having. and thinking about how do I work with them, and spending a lot of time going back to Hopi talking about these things. And I just remember that as my reading and writing got better, I was seeing myself writing speeches and delivering them by reading them. But the first time I decided to not read my notes, but to say it out loud, I had to think about, well, I have to practice saying this speech. So I would record myself. But when I recorded myself, it just did not, it sounded too scripted. It wasn't sincere. It wasn't coming from the heart. It was something I really worked at. And so I put away the reading and writing. But it was really tough to think about using the language in a very conversational way. And at one point, I was speaking to a group of community members, and I very honestly told them, I grew up out here, Hopi was my first language, but I quit speaking it, so I can't think in it now, but I can still understand it. And a gentleman in the audience said to me, I just can't understand how you can say you can understand, but you can't speak it. What do you mean by that? And that was the first time anybody actually challenged me in explaining that. And I had to be really quick and think on my feet. And I said, well, I think what that means to me right now is that there's two places in your brain where you process language. One part, you bring in the language, and another part is you put out the language. And that bridge between those two places in my brain is broken. And so I can understand it, but I can't produce it. So it means I can't think in it. So that's something I have to work on. And from there, it just became, it seems like every step of the way, there was something like that in my personal experience that made me think more deeply about how you help fluent speakers then teach the language in the schools to young people who are essentially second language learners of their own language. So I think at that time I was getting closer and closer to taking the work that I was doing at the American Indian Language Institute, observing what was happening there in terms of immersion and focusing on oral speaking of the language as a method of teaching the language and giving the language back to community youth. But what I always saw was that in the American Indian Language Institute program, their what do they call that? One of the very important components of that program is to do immersion teaching demonstration. And I could always see everything in place in terms of the stage, the actors, the language, the people, but oftentimes there was no language script. They would immediately turn to just talking about the culture, and in the past couple of days we've been talking about how the emphasis has always turned to culture and not so much the language, and I can confirm that from my observations. So I decided to bring those ideas to Hopi, and I took this ALDI model out to Hopi and delivered summer month-long programs on Hopi for 7 years. And on the first day, there was a lot of sweating behind the scenes, like Richard said. It was sort of the same context. I had a room full of fluent-speaking Hopi who were teaching the language or wanted to teach the language in schools, but they didn't have the way to do that effectively. So that was my job. But there I am standing in front of them, having that background, but not being able to speak the language. And it seems kind of ironic to be standing there and saying, I'm going to help you teach the language to the kids, but I don't speak it myself. That was my scary part. But I decided that that was okay. That was my new struggle, and I was going to use that opportunity to work that out. And the playing field became quite balanced on that first day. I went and I told them the same thing. I left the reservation. I used to speak it. I can't speak it now, but I want to learn how to speak it, and I want you to help me do that here, but I can help you in return. And so I said, you can always talk Hopi. I understand it. And I will do a lot of the note-taking for us. And that's what really amazed them, that I could write it and read it back to them. So I was capturing their knowledge that they were sharing on the chalkboard at the time. And one woman stopped and said, how can you just write like that? And I said, well, writing is just a skill. Anybody can learn to read and write Hopi at some point. I happened to just learn it first before speaking. But I'm amazed at the knowledge you're giving me. So I'm just capturing that right here for us. And that actually was a good way to have started off that whole project for the next 7 years. And I did make lots of mistakes. It was interesting also for them to ask me things like, so does our language have the same kind of aspects like English, like verbs and nouns and pronouns? I said, yeah, I mean, because when I say something wrong or incorrectly, you are quick to let me know that. So that means that you already know all the rules of how Hopi is supposed to be spoken. You don't even think about it, but you recognize it. So when you correct me, you're actually demonstrating these rules and you're explaining them to me. And then one of the funny things, I told them I'm gonna make lots of mistakes, but I'm okay with that. And I remember that first day, it was time for a break, and I told them, I thought I was saying, okay, now you guys go on break. And everybody just stopped and looked at me and they said, and they said, you mean you want us to break, literally break? Because I used the wrong word for break. And I said, well, what's the right word then? And they said, nasing nayani, go relax for a few minutes. So that was kind of the reciprocal exchange that started happening with them as fluent speakers and me as relearning my language, because I had the vocabulary, but I didn't have the process for using it correctly in place. So I'm going to leave it at there and pass it on to the other people.
Thank you, Sheilah. I think both Richard and Sheilah have given you a perspective of people that have the language or had access to the language in the beginning. And I think that our next two speakers will give a different perspective on second language learning.
Okay. Hinamam kimo hinimba. Tathaikam turbase. Tathutaiwem. Hebai in a taiwem. Yepathui in keweiwem. Good morning, everybody. My name's Christina Otero, and I'm from Sandia Pueblo. I said my Indian name is Thurbese, and the direction that we come from is the east, and our corn color is white. And those are the things that our kids are learning now in language class after school. We have after school language Tuesdays and Wednesdays for 30 minutes. And it takes a long time for them to learn things because that's a really short time for a language class. But they're learning and they can introduce themselves now and they can say all the directions, all the clans that go with those directions, the colors of corn that go with those directions. So I think that's a big deal. And I don't know if they know that's a big deal, but this is where we're at now in language class. And those guys are really smart. And they learn most of them learn really quick, even the ones that don't come all the time. The tribe is very supportive of language program. And so we've been trying hard to learn the best ways to teach anybody that doesn't know how to talk. So that's why we come to ILI, and the main thing that we learn is that immersion is the best way. The young kids, I think it's easy for them. The older people, adults, I think it's hard because we have our ways already, how we went to school, how we learned things, and maybe those are just excuses for not learning, but it's just kind of hard. And I wanted to say that I want you all to know that I'm not fluent in my language, nowhere near it, and I don't even know if I'm worthy to be up here with these people because they're way, way, way beyond me. And I feel like I'm just about that far in my language, and they're way above that. But we can all do it if we try. And I guess the thing is that a lot of times the people think that they're going to learn language by going to class, and that's not the situation. And we've been told that by a couple of our elders that say, if you think you're going to learn here, you're wrong. You have to go out and learn. This is only like a stepping stone. These are little examples for you to use to get you started. And I think that's where the learning kind of stops, because some people don't have anybody to practice with at home, and that's a hard situation. And like the little kids now, they know these things, but their parents don't. So if they talk to their parents don't even know what they're saying. So that's a bummer. And we encourage the parents to come, but they're working, so it's hard for them. And I don't know if that's all we're doing is just making excuses, or because the tribes behind us, they put the money out there, and it's like, well, how come all you guys aren't coming to learn? Where are you all at? And so we're over there racking our brains trying to think about ways to enable the people to come, to make it easier for them to come. But I don't know, maybe it's too easy. I don't know what the deal is, because they're not coming. And just barely now, some of the guys, the men that are young on council are trying now to learn, because they are in a position where they have to talk. And so we do have we're lucky to get another speaker. He's from Isleta. They speak the same language as we do, and also it's a southern dialect. And Taos and Piccaries, they speak the same language as well, but they're in the northern dialect. And I think that's another problem that we have, is that nobody wants to teach. We have 3 people from Sandia that are teaching. One is an elderly gentleman, and one is Nana Marty here. We're all considered elderlies, but I don't think we feel like we're that. But, and also, I think all our fluent speakers are over 65 years old. So that's another crisis right there. And it's like an emergency situation, but nobody can see that it's an emergency, because they have to work, they have to pay bills, they have to take care of their kids. And a long time ago, it was just spoken for the people. It was the natural thing. Little by little, it didn't get spoken. And I do think that the boarding school situation had a lot to do with that. Another thing is that, like for me, my grandpa was from Sandia, but my grandma was from Acoma. So they couldn't converse in Indian because they were different languages. But my grandma used to tell her husband, you gotta teach these guys, their children, how to speak. And she said he would get bugged and tell her, well, why don't you teach them your language? And she said, well, this is where we live. They have to learn Sandia because this is where we're at. And so my mom knew how to speak Tiwa and Keres, but then when I was a little girl, we got in a car accident and she passed away. So then I was with my grandparents, and my grandma did try to teach me Keres, but it's to me, very different and difficult. It has sounds that we don't really make in our language, or maybe we do, I just don't know it yet, but it just seemed really hard. And so my experience has been to go to language class whenever anybody has the desire to put up a class. And it's been since, gosh, maybe the 70s since I've been going to language class. And like he was saying, a lot of the people that were speaking, they're not here anymore. But we do have people that know the language and they wanna pass it on, but people don't seem to wanna learn. I don't know, I'm sure they do want to learn, but it's really hard to give up your time. I don't know what the deal is, but for myself, I feel like listening to the people that had learned already and went away and then came back and had to sort of learn again, well, maybe I need to step it up and work harder, because everything is pretty much there. And so now I have grandkids, and they don't really know how to speak either. But whatever I know, I try to talk to them, but it's just not enough, you know. And I don't know if we'll ever be able to think in Tiwa, but maybe we will. And those are the things that have happened in my life that I don't know. There was just never a consistent speaker that would talk to me whether I understood or not, and that would keep talking to me whether I understood or not. But now I'm in the side where I'm teaching the little kids, and I try not to get tired or impatient when they don't get it. And it's okay if they don't say it right, you know, right away. But I don't know. To me, it's really hard. And now there's all these electronics, and we work in the library. The kids come, they only want to use the computer. And so now we're thinking maybe that's the way to go. I don't know. We're thinking about that, about seeing if we can use technology to help, because maybe that will make the kids excited and motivated to learn. We haven't tried it yet, but we will. We do have those 2 books on CD, but those are for the little kids, and the little kids are doing really well. But that's how it is in Sandia for now. And maybe next time when we come back, we'll have a better, more positive story. And maybe we can bring some speakers that are more fluent. So thanks. and good luck to all of you with your programs. Thank you.
Okay, does dim llawer o amser gyda ni, achos mae pobl yn y panel yma roedd llawer o pethau pwysig I ddweud. So I don't have as much time to talk about here what I wanted to. So I'm going to sort of do my talk in the breakout session because everyone else had really important things to say and we didn't want to rush anybody. So I'm going to talk about a couple things in the breakout session, and it stems from a question that students learning the language ask, and then another question that teachers of the language ask. And for teachers, the question is, how come at the beginning of my program there's 25 people, and then as the weeks go on, everyone drops out, and maybe there's only 3 or 4 at the end? Well, having been the student going through a language program, I know why, or at least I know why the people in our program dropped out. And so I'd like to talk about that. And then I'd also like to talk about, from the learner's point of view, almost do like a one of those like self-help sessions where we identify the difficulties that we as learners of the language have and realize that we're not alone and that we've all gone through these things, and that dropping out of language learning isn't the only solution to the feelings and the difficulties that you have as a learner, and that there are identifying the problem and then some ways of overcoming that problem so that we can sort of break through that baggage barrier that prevents so many people from learning the language, and then we can push forward and become, fulfill our destiny as a speaker to be. So I'll talk about that in the breakouts, because I think we're done.
I'd like to thank you for all staying here, and I'm glad you heard the experiences that people have had with regard to second language learning, and I really invite you to come to our breakout session so that we can hear more of what Chris had to say in his personal experience with his heritage language. And I think that by sharing this way, we get to have some insight into what it is we're doing and what it is we're facing and the challenges that we have to overcome. And I'm very encouraged by your attendance here, and it's been a wonderful conference, a wonderful symposium, and I'm really happy to be here. So we'll see you at the next session and also the breakout this afternoon.